For this reason, I remind you to rekindle the gift of God that is within you through the laying on of my hands. My friends, raise your hand if you have ever tried to rekindle a fire. And I don't mean a romance, I mean a literal fire, okay? Hands up so I can see them if you try to do that. Okay, all right, so some of us, but not all of us, go ahead and put your hands down. If you've never tried to rekindle a literal fire, the thing you need to know is that it is essentially the same process as starting a new fire. You need tinder to ignite a small flame. You need kindling to strengthen it. You need to feed oxygen into that fuel so that it intensifies in heat. And then you need to slowly introduce increasingly large pieces of firewood until you have a useful flame, something with which to warm yourself or to cook over. The only significant difference between starting a new fire and rekindling an old one is that you don't need a new heat source. You don't need a new spark, because the life of the fire is already there, buried in the ashes. Instead of creating a new spark with flint or friction, the residual heat stored in the embers of the original fire is what ignites the flame of the one that is rekindled. You have to sift through the ashes of the fire that has gone out in order to uncover the charcoal beneath and expose it to oxygen. And once able to breathe, the embers become visible to the naked eye, glowing reddish orange. And once even a small amount of kindling is introduced to that, it begins to smoke and bursts in the flame. That fire that seemed to have died comes alive again. And my friends, that is precisely what St. Paul encourages Timothy to do with the gift of God that is within him, to rekindle the flame that seems to have gone out. It is not clear from Paul's letter what circumstances have extinguished the flame of God's gift in Timothy. Paul mentions Timothy's tears, so it seems that something is grieving him. He's sad. But it is precisely in the midst of Timothy's sufferings, whatever they might be, that Paul urges him to rekindle the fire that is within him. The gift of God that Paul mentions, the gift that Timothy received with the laying on of Paul's hands, is the source of faith that first lived in Timothy's mother and his grandmother and now lives in him. The gift of God is something that Paul describes as the spirit of power and of love and of self-discipline. It is none other than the Holy Spirit living within Timothy, as Paul says at the conclusion of our reading this morning. The Spirit that Timothy received by the laying on of Paul's hands, first at his baptism and then again at his ordination, is the very same Spirit that descended upon all of the apostles as tongues of fire on the day of Pentecost. The Holy Spirit that dwelled within Timothy was a fire that powered the engine of his faith. But for whatever reason, that fire and the faith that depended upon it seemed to have been snuffed out entirely. And again, we can't be sure what circumstances have led to Timothy feeling like this fire was extinguished. But we know that it would have been easy for him to respond with a spirit of cowardice, what Paul says, for him to shrink back from the present moment, to give up, to seek greener pastures elsewhere. But Paul reminds Timothy that the spirit that he received, the spirit that still lives in him now, is not a spirit of cowardice. rather than venture out into the cold dark of unbelief. Paul instructs Timothy to rekindle the fire of the Holy Spirit, to reignite the engines of faith. And just like rekindling a literal fire, rekindling the fire of the Holy Spirit, rekindling faith, will require much the same work as when Timothy first received it. Paul reminds Timothy of his examples of faith, his mother, his grandmother. And Paul reminds Timothy of his laying on of hands. Paul reminds Timothy of these things because Timothy must remember that the Spirit had real power in his past in order for him to trust in the Spirit's power in the present. Refusing a spirit of cowardice, Timothy must recommit to nurturing a spirit of power and of love and of self-discipline. And how does he do this? How might he do this? He might nurture the spirit of power by acting in expectation that the Spirit will again do amazing things in his midst. He might nurture a spirit of love by seeking the well-being of all of those around him with all the zeal that he can muster. And he might nurture the spirit of self-discipline by exercising those spiritual practices that he first learned from Paul and from his mother and from his grandmother before he was ever baptized. Habits of prayer, of ministry to the downtrodden, and of fellowship with his fellow believers. For Timothy, who we should remember is a young pastor, this would surely feel like starting over in his life of faith. But we should remember that the Holy Spirit was already there, living within him. Timothy only needs to expose the embers to oxygen, add a little tinder and kindling, and then that fire will burst back into life. Everything that Timothy needs is already available to him, even if he can't see it yet. He needs only to decide to act, to commit to rekindling the fire. And my friends, the same is true for us. Maybe some of us gathered here today feel a little like Timothy. Maybe we feel like the fire of the Holy Spirit and of faith has gone out in us. Perhaps because of the circumstances of today or of the past years has left us feeling like the gift of God that we once so enjoyed has been extinguished in us. If that is the case, then Paul's word to Timothy is a word to us as well. If today we feel that the fire has gone out, we can know with confidence that it can be rekindled. Just as Paul laid his hands upon Timothy, so too were the hands of the church placed upon us in holy baptism. That moment was real and it was effective. Like Timothy, on that day we too received the gift of the Holy Spirit living within us. On that day, a fire was started within us. And even if we find ourselves in circumstances where our faith feels dead, we can know that the Holy Spirit has by no means departed from us. The embers of the Spirit still burn beneath the ashes. We need only push them aside, expose the coals to oxygen, introduce a little fuel, a little new air, and it will come back as it did before, burning bright and as hot once more. And my friends, this can happen in our corporate life as a parish family, just as surely as it can happen in our individual lives. What St. Paul encouraged Timothy to do is the very thing that I believe that he is calling this church which bears his name to do, to rekindle the gift of God that is within us. After 2.5 years of pandemic troubles, of political tumult, of profound social change, it would be easy for any congregation to succumb to a spirit of cowardice, to step back from the challenge of the present moment, to seek greener pastures elsewhere. But my friends, the parish family of St. Paul's did not receive a spirit of cowardice. We have been here for more than 150 years, and God willing, we will be here for 150 more. The Holy Spirit fire that lived in the generations before us still burns within us now. We need only sift through the ashes, put new fuel on the fire, and fan the flames. And that is exactly what each and every one of us is being called to do today. On this day, in addition to being Episcopal School Sunday, we're also launching our annual pledge campaign, the theme of which is Live Faithfully. And for those of you who call St. Paul's home, I want you to have that phrase in your head as a permanent installation. Live faithfully. Because more than the financial necessity that it is every year, this pledge campaign marks the beginning of a new chapter in the life of St. Paul's Episcopal Church. It marks the beginning of a season of rekindling. Because with this pledge campaign, we are also launching a new visual identity for the whole church that we have developed together over the past year, which will represent this parish family in both physical and digital spaces. And you have the first evidence of this in your hands right now. The bulletin, the cover, the typeface, all of it is the first installation of this coming change. We'll also be introducing a new website, and it's slick. Updated social media platforms, all of this coming later this week. And perhaps most important of all, we are introducing new mission, vision, and value statements that will help define who we want to be as a people as we proceed into our future together. Now, just as it was for Timothy, this work of rekindling might feel like starting over. It might feel like the task is too daunting given our circumstances. But also, like Timothy, we already have everything that we need within us to live faithfully. We don't need a new spark. The same Holy Spirit that lived in the generations before us lives in us now. The work of this year's pledge campaign and all the mission work that will parallel it is tinder and kindling placed upon the embers of our past. My friends, the flame that will burst forth from these efforts will burn as bright and as hot as the fire of previous generations. And the flame that we will rekindle in this season ahead will power the life of faith, not only for the generations represented in this room, and there are many generations in this room, but for generations still to come as well. Together, we will rekindle the gift of God that lives in this place. We will nurture a spirit of power and of love and of self-discipline. And as Paul says, we will guard the good treasure entrusted to us with the help of the Holy Spirit living in us. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.